as well. So sorry about that. I don't know what that was, but really looking at a budget that also starts to invest in those areas of the city, in mental health support, in things like guaranteed basic income, which is something we had been working on for many years prior to this administration, and to see a good amount of funding going to about 5,000 families at about $500 a month, just to give them the support that they need to make sure they can do things like buy food and pay their rent, I think was a huge step forward for the city. Guaranteed basic income is using ARP funds to kind of move forward, but I think it's something that'll give people a lift in communities that have really needed it for a long time. We saw a lot of things, I think, in this budget that progressives for many years had been trying to move forward on environmental issues, as I mentioned, on mental health issues, guaranteed basic income. But a lot of the things that this city wants to do is really interdependent on also what happens at the state level. So even though our bond ratings got better, our interest rates are better, and we can put money into the pensions that really is the big driver of the cost of the city, along with our debt payments. We need help from the state to do things like a progressive income tax. And whether people believe that's the right way to go or not, Illinois is one of those states that relies heavily on property taxes, and really does, I think, a disservice to people on the lower economic scale who pay more in taxes, I think, than in some ways the corporations do. So a progressive income tax at the state level would really benefit cities across Illinois, but especially Chicago, in making sure that we can support the budgets that we need. The issues that I think we are still having a lot of difficulty on, that we're starting to make headway on, a lot of is like police reform. We're working under a consent decree right now. I think the mayor's been pushing back against the FOP, the union, as much as she can, even when it comes to the vaccine recently, that sort of got jumbled up, I think, in the media. People have said, almost Trumpian like, that we don't need to jab everybody with the vaccine. But if you're a worker for the city, we strongly believe that having the vaccine is something important for people, to make sure that if you are serving and protecting or serving the people of this city, that you need to be at the front end of the vaccine and make sure that you get it to protect people throughout the city. And obviously that turned into a pretty big fight, but what we've seen is the majority of people in the city workforce are moving in that direction. And then, Professor, I'll kind of wrap it up a little bit about what's been happening with things like aldermanic privilege, aldermanic prerogative, and the battle between, I think, the mayor and the city council, which is a multifaceted problem. So when the mayor came in, one of the things that she wanted to tackle early on was aldermanic prerogative. And most people, when they think of aldermanic prerogative, they're thinking about zoning issues, how aldermen decide everything from affordable housing to infrastructure improvements and other things. And, early on, when I talked to the mayor about this, my opinion was, if you're going to tackle things like aldermanic prerogative, which aldermen in Chicago have more than just about any other elected officials in municipalities throughout the United States, it's really changing the rules and changing the guidelines or the guardrails that we have, and tightening those up so that there's less opportunity to make individual choices that can hurt people throughout the city. And the mayor kind of tackled this thing head on, which really led to a lot of animosity with the city council, and therefore what looks like a lot of pushback on just about anything that she's doing. And then that is in part true. But I think a lot of what that comes from is aldermen feeling that they can't be told what to do in their individual wards, their little fiefdoms, that whether it's constituents or the mayor, shouldn't be allowed to kind of direct what happens there. I think in the long run, what's going to happen is as we build better guardrails, as we build better ordinances and better rules around what aldermen can and cannot do, the city council becomes a better place to do business, but also has, in some ways, a stronger footing with the executive branch, but I think in a way that should benefit everybody as opposed to benefiting individuals. And so that battle is going to be going for a long, long time. I think as we look at the way that the city has shifted in the politics, it's important to know that when we look at these different votes that have been coming out, and Professor Simpson puts out a pretty comprehensive voting guideline about how people voted and what types of things they're voting for. I think what we're seeing is, in some ways, closer votes that can be, I think, can be regarded as a good back and forth between the administrative side and the legislative side. And that forces some ways better discussion, better opportunity for discussions about everything from, the pushback that we got on universal basic income and finally being able to put that into a budget and passing it, I think is a success. And then you look at things like settlements for police, where we've been trying to reform that, or workers' comp issues where we've been trying to reform that, where too much power was based in one committee, the committee I run, which is the finance committee. All that power was based under one person for, I think, 30, Professor, I can't recall how long, but almost 40 years under one person. And so to diffuse that power and make it more equitable throughout the city government, I think is doing a service to everybody by decentralizing it and allowing for a little bit more back and forth discussion and a lot more transparency in terms of how government works. And then hopefully with, I think as we see the investments in areas of the city that have been divested, we see economies start to build up, and we see a shift in the resources. We see a shift in the way things build up. This also comes through, I think, a lot of the efforts that have been put forth by different communities, different citizens who've really been able to communicate more with aldermen and what they want to see in these budgets and what they want to see in government, and hopefully change that over time. I think I'll stop there, and maybe if you want to jump into questions, Professor Simpson.
Yes, maybe Scott, you could talk just a little more about, it's unusual for someone to give up power, and you gave up, in the case of the Finance Committee, control over workman's comp. Maybe you can explain a bit more about that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the remap issue that's currently facing the city council with the December 1st deadline, and with three maps, the Black Caucus map and the independent map, or the People's map, was introduced today. So there's the Latino map, the Black map, and the independent map. So first of all, about giving up power, can you talk a little bit more about what brought that about? And then can you talk a little bit about the remap, and then we'll open it to the floor, and I'll help recognize people to ask their questions.
Sure. So starting out with workers' comp, doesn't sound like a big thing, but when you're a city employee and you're working, whether you're a policeman, a fireman, a streets and sand worker on the back of a truck, or just about anybody out there, if you get hurt doing city business and you go on to workers' comp, you file a claim, and essentially the city says, okay, go see a doctor, go for rehab, but you're going to take this amount of time off and we're going to pay you. And for several decades, unlike any other city in the United States, the workers' comp program is housed in most cities or municipalities, it's housed in the executive branch, probably under the comptroller's office or what they call a treasurer's office. And then what they do is they manage that program. A lot of cities have a third-party management company doing it. And what we were trying to do for years here was to, as an alderman in previous administrations, some of us were trying to move it out from the Committee on Finance on the legislative side of things, and get performance audits, not just a financial audit, but a performance audit of what was happening with workers' comp. It's in Chicago, it's about $100 million a year program. And what we were seeing was that the same people were filing workers' comp claims over and over again, just like they do in some other cities and suburbs. And there was no transparency around it. It was all kind of behind closed doors. Alderman Ed Burke ran the program and kept it very close to his vest. So when I became the finance chair, we finalized moving all that program out into the open and putting it over to the city comptroller's office. And since then, what we've been working on is COVID slowed things down a little bit, but we have an outside firm doing an audit, and we just got the preliminary audits back right now. But we essentially gave up that power in the committee to say, I no longer control the doctors, the lawyers, and how those city employees benefit from that program, and also expose the whole thing so that it's going to be out there for the public to see exactly what the value of that program is. So that step one was to relinquish control over that in the finance committee, which obviously also generated dozens and dozens of jobs for Ed Burke and the committee. So we went from, I think at the time that Ed Burke ran it 2+ years ago, there were almost 75 people on his staff, I think, at one point. When we moved workers' comp out, we reduced the staff in our office by 50 to 52. And then we also took the finance committee staff down from about roughly 35 down to about 3 right now of my staff in that committee, and 3 that work on small claims. So we've got about 6 people as compared to about this, I think it was roughly 72 to 75, give or take a few people, hopefully generating some savings there on an annual basis of a little over $2.5 million, but also relinquishing control of that. And then on the remap right now, Professor, I didn't see that other map was submitted today, but we were working off of 2 types of maps. One was the Latino caucus map, which had a really good discussion on Friday, kind of a back and forth between the Black caucus and the Latino caucus. I've been working individually on my map with 8 of my surrounding aldermen. So I touch 32nd Ward touches 7 other, maybe actually 8 other wards that I have to work with to draw the lines on that map. And as you can probably see from either Cranes or maybe a couple other articles out there, I was trying to shift my ward boundaries back east in some way to pick up Lincoln Yards, which has become a real hot button issue in this remap process. As a lot of you know, Lincoln Yards was received the massive TIF under Rahm Emanuel. Properties were kind of sold off for pennies on the dollar, and Sterling Bay was the company that kind of took over that whole area. So I'm kind of in a battle with Alderman Brian Hopkins over who gets to have that massive set of properties under their purview in the next map. And we have to have a full city map by December 1st. So it's my understanding that everybody's trying to hustle to take pieces of what they've seen from the change map, the fair map, from the Latino caucus map, the Black caucus map, and kind of put them all together so that you have a pretty comprehensive map. If you don't get 41 aldermen to sign on to whichever map there might be, 10 aldermen can file for a referendum to have a vote on all these different maps. And that's a potential that we might see, that voters might be voting on several different maps in the next election, which would be in June. So anytime you have a referendum, it goes on the next major election, which because there was COVID, the state parties pushed the primary elections back until June of this upcoming year, and that would be the next place that a referendum vote would take place for any maps. But people are working furiously in the map room. In fact, I just saw there was a communication that the chairwoman, Michelle Harris, had asked everybody to make sure that they got into these map rooms where you're essentially looking at a sort of a shared mapping process that all the aldermen in a surrounding area might go into the room, 2 at a time, 8 at a time, and try to figure out where those boundaries make sense. For me, I just try to look at contiguous boundaries. So, for instance, my map goes straight down Western, straight across North Avenue, and then sort of along the river, except for portions a little bit further north, and try to follow the guidelines of the Voters' Rights Act, which basically says, to try to make communities of interest. That's not happening in every ward. A lot of people do the family and friends plan, where they literally pick people that they want to keep in a ward and draw lines, and that's typically what you see some of these boundaries look like. We have a battle kind of going on with the second ward right now, which is that ward that runs from Lincoln Park all the way down into the Gold Coast with Brian Hopkins. And a lot of people have said, 90% of your ward is downtown. Why do you have to have that sliver that runs miles north to pick up a small area? And those are the kind of contentious battles that I think some of us are trying to square off and just do maps that are similar to the change map. But those are sometimes meetings that are very heated, sometimes very cordial, and they often go up until the night before December 1st when you try to get a map passed.
And then just one other general question, Scott, before we go to the specific questions I'm sure people have. What do you see as the future role of the city council in the next 2 years before the election in 2023?
Well, I think making sure that we you want to be able to work with the administration, but you also want to have independence. So for me, the Committee on Finance, we try to be as independent as possible to make sure that aldermen have hearings about the types of financial issues that they want to hear, whether it's about police settlements or city settlements, risk management, workers' comp programs, audits, things like that, and even TIF issues. You want to have that independence continue to build up, so that if there are times when there has to be a contentious vote, that it's done in the right way, but there's facts on the table. And that in the years past, we weren't always able to get that out there. So I want to continue to see the council build on that transparency and openness. But I think there's going to be a lot of battles that take place, and there's a lot of I think there's a lot of factions now within the council. There are some people that have, I think, dug their heels in no matter what. They won't cooperate with the mayor's office. They won't talk to him. And I can tell you that very often people will say, well, I never got this or I never got that. And a lot of that stuff comes through the finance committee, and it's just, it's pretty open about what's really happening. But in some ways, you have to move the city forward with the equity issues that we need to address. But you also need to have just enough, I think, pushback to make sure that programs are done better on a constant basis. Trying to change government that's been one way for several decades can't happen overnight. So you need to kind of have a continual prod to change things consistently, and over time, watch as they change. And Chicago is not much different than many other cities where if something was run one way for decades, you need to constantly work to change those things to meet the more modern needs.
Thanks very much. We're open for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand using the raise your hand function down under reactions, or simply unmute yourself and we will see you on the screen and I'll recognize you to ask your question. But do ask them. We have about 15 minutes to a little more, about 25 minutes to ask questions. Yes, Philip.
Hi, my question is regarding the increased tax. So last year, when we were voting for the presidential election, we had the option in Illinois we had to select yes or no, and I think it was like 55 or 50 something percent of people said no. How do you think, if this many people in this state, which is I would call a solid blue state, said no, how do you think we could actually implement this plan?
Do you mean for property tax increase, or?
He meant
It was
the state
the
vote,
state.
state referendum on the income tax, Scott.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Well, first of all, I think the governor and his folks, who were really sort of the primary drivers of that tax, didn't run a great campaign. So a lot of these things, you have to run a really good campaign, and I think there was just heads butting on either side, and it wasn't explained very well. I think if because it really came down to almost like a 50-50 type of a vote. But I think if people realized on the red side of things, or people who were skeptical of it, that the diversity of those of that income, and really getting the extremely wealthy people to pay their fair share of taxes, that wealth gets spread out, that it kind of equalizes the tax base, I think more people would have been on it. And what we didn't explain, or what we didn't see explained, in my estimation, was that we rely too much across municipalities and across counties on property taxes. And property taxes just, can be very overbearing. And without having that same argument going at the same time, or discussion going, that, look, if we push for a graduated income tax, and at the same time we push for a reduction in property taxes, that kind of equalizes itself. And then you see that shift coming with the guaranteed, or with the graduated income tax. I think people would have been more accepting of it. But I think what people were seeing was, oh, I'm going to pay huge property taxes, which a lot of people do, but then I'm going to have to pay more of a income tax as well. Well, then I'm just not going to be for that. And I think the Republicans did a much better job of making it sound like you were going to get double hit, and therefore it didn't pass. So I think the future has to be, we need to reform our property tax system. And believe me, in Cook County and in Chicago, as Professor Simpson knows, there's a lot more reforms that need to happen on property tax assessments. You got guys like Fritz Kagi trying to right size the system right now, and he's got other actors who are undermining the property tax system. My predecessor used to benefit from property tax appeals for decades, along with Mike Madigan, that really ruined the whole system for several decades, and it still has. And the people who are pushing back against the graduated income tax are the same people who are benefiting from, in some ways, the property tax appeals process, it's a very sticky mess as well. So it's not just Chicago, but this county and the state need to do a lot more to right size everything and be fair across the board. And I think that led a lot of people to vote against it.
Thank you.
And Brenda, did you have a comment? You put in the chat, but the alderman can't see it, so you need to unmute yourself and make it.
Yeah, I see that. It says, why not reduce local governments like integrated townships and special districts? And that's a really good point, and it's a really important one to make. There are organizations that have been studying that for a long time. I worked in Berwyn for about a little over a year, where we went in and tried to change things up there with a new mayor. We got rid of some of the, the smaller entities, tried to merge some of the districts, so you didn't have 2 or 3 park districts or a township doing the same work that other people were doing. And I think there's a report that goes back about 10 years that Illinois, at least Northeast Illinois, has something like 1,400 government entities just in the northeastern part of Illinois, in sort of this Chicagoland area. And that's pretty astronomical when you think about it. If you look at Chicago and then the 130 roughly suburbs or villages that are around us, you would think, okay, well, there should be about maybe 500 or 400 types of entities, townships. And townships were created, a couple hundred years ago as counties were built up. But I think that's a great point, because each one of them has created this taxing entity that really taps into people's taxes. They might be doing duplicate work. They might be doing no work at all. They might just be creating jobs to create jobs. And I think if we did away with a lot of those, and I think it was the BGA that might have put that report out, if I'm not mistaken, that we could reduce the overall government taxes throughout the area. And Chicago itself, we don't have, we have SSAs, which are taxing bodies. Those are different than TIFs. And SSAs, we have over 130 of those. They always want to expand, but those are throughout different neighborhoods that are a separate taxing agency on top of city taxing agencies like City of Chicago, CPS, MWRD, which is Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, and maybe Mosquito District. So yes, I fully agree that we have to take a serious look at that over the next few years, but that requires people to give up power. And once people get some of this power, especially in my, just looking at it in Chicagoland, people don't want to give up that power, because those are, cush jobs in some ways. There's no accountability to a lot of these people. They're not open governments, and they make good salaries and create, contracts. So a lot of those people that have been living off these entities for a long time may or may not give those up.
So this is your chance to ask one of the powerful and thoughtful aldermen of the city your questions. So please unmute yourself and hold your hand up and ask your questions.
Yeah, I didn't see that first part of that, but it says Illinois keeps taxing people out. And I think that's, I'll just touch on that note again for a second. So when you look at Chicago, the 2 biggest drivers of taxes here, which almost everything's paid for by property taxes, fines and fees, things like that, which is a whole nother issue. The 2 biggest drivers of what our costs are for the city is, number one, debt and pensions. And obviously we're a labor city, we're a labor county. And so unless there is a constitutional change of the Illinois Constitution, there can't be changes, major changes on the pensions. Like, you cannot declare bankruptcy without passing a state law that allows, for instance, a city like Detroit did. Detroit declared bankruptcy, and they essentially sold off all of Detroit's assets to right-size that city and to fix things. Obviously, they were already in the hole, and they went through a large hemorrhaging process as they did that. But in Illinois, you can't do that without a constitutional change, and you also can't really go after or change pensions without major change in the state constitution, which is not just the state General Assembly doing it, but making I guess it would be on a referendum to change that. So our 2 biggest drivers, again, massive debt and huge pension payments. The debt portion of it, we were in a hole for a long time because in the 90s and the 2000s, Mayor Daley and then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who later on in his tenure, I think in his last term, started to address this issue. But we had what we called scoop and toss borrowing. Scoop and toss borrowing was, in the most uncomplicated way, basically saying you borrowed on top of borrowing and created higher, more flexing interest rates that cost you more over time. So we were paying more and more for borrowing. That drove our debt up quite dramatically over about a 20, 30-year period. And then the fact that we weren't paying into the pensions and the fact that we were kicking debt costs down the road kind of led us to a point about 5 years ago where we had to really, we really wanted to do a scoop and toss with Mayor Lightfoot has done that this year. We got rid of scoop and toss entirely. We still do geo debt refinancing, which every city in the United States does. That's our main way of borrowing and then building infrastructure. But under this administration, I think with a push from a lot of us who wanted to see something different, we've seen a reduction and then a total breakaway from scoop and toss borrowing. And hopefully that will drive some of the taxes down and make it more stable here for people. But with that has to come reform to the property tax system, which is really hemorrhaging. Whether you own a house or you rent a house, that those property taxes can really, for a lot of you, decide whether you are making or breaking it in the city. Because if your property tax go up dramatically, obviously the landlord has to find a way to make that up, and they usually stick it right to the renters. And that's where I think the reforms that we're trying to do, both in the city and at the county level, obviously I don't have as much push on, but to change those requires people, again, giving up power. And in this Chicago, Cook County, Illinois structure, a lot of people don't want to give up power.
Maybe since you served under both, we'll take Grace's question first. Go ahead, Grace, and then Alan.
Oh, sorry, my question's a little unrelated. So you're actually my alderman. I grew up in Wicker Park. So lately with Bucktown, lately with the carjackings, there's been a lot of call for more police. What kind of relationship or power does the alderman have working with the police?
That's actually a good question, because right now, Bucktown, Wicker Park, and I would say parts of Lakeview have been getting hammered by carjackers. So I get a text anytime there is one, or a strong arm robbery, which might be, a carjacking or somebody getting hit by, somebody with a gun or something like that. I actually have a great rapport with the police in my area. So anytime something like that happens, I get a text or I get a call from a commander or sergeant to say, hey, we just wanted to let you know this happened. They don't tell me the details of the victim, because there's privacy rights there. And you kind of juxtapose that with the push for police reforms, and the push against the FOP and their contract and how that operates. And some people, more recently, as the mayor pushed to get every police officer vaccinated, some people in my community were saying, you just don't get it. You're making people more unsafe by forcing these officers to get a vaccine, and you're taking more officers off the street. Well, that just wasn't happening. There were only a handful, a couple dozen officers who refused to comply with the mandate. And I thought it was a good one. You protect and serve people, then you should be ready to do the things that put you at the front end and ready to go. But I would say that, this has been one of the hardest periods for me to work, because you don't want to see anybody get hurt. You don't want to see any resident, any business be victimized, especially by carjackers. And so there's a lot of things. We're trying to keep the police out there on the street. you want some more officers out there on the street, which we got, but you also have to look at other parts of the city that weren't getting the services and weren't getting the respect and weren't getting the diverse officers that they needed to make sure their communities were safe. So there's a little bit of a balance that has to be done there, but I think most people in the ward, most people in my area, whether it's my ward or not, realize that we have to, public safety is the number one priority for kids going to school, for the parents. And we've had several carjackings where they dragged kids out of the car to get the car, or they almost took off with kids. And to me, that's one of the scariest things, especially having kids. I don't want to see that happen to anybody. But sometimes too, things like I see somebody Emmanuel brought up the Citizen app. We have a Facebook page in the area, a few Facebook pages, and sometimes those get a little out of hand too, and spread a little bit of disinformation. So it's a constant balance trying to help people, especially the victims, and reassure people that they're in a safe community without really comparing them to other neighborhoods, but to also make sure that the police are advocating for them and out there on the street and keeping things as safe as they can. And that's tough sometimes with the reforms going on, but you need to be able to do all of it at once. And I feel pretty reassured. I'm out there on the street. I spend a lot of my Fridays and Saturdays and sometimes Thursdays out on the street late at night from like 10 to 2, looking at our bars, see what's happening there. My neighboring wards are also very difficult because sometimes they take a different approach and more hands off with some of the areas that are rougher and bars that aren't, for instance, doing the right things. So that becomes a little difficult, but trying to be collaborative and make sure the neighborhood is safe is a priority.
Alan, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for your time. So I think one of the biggest things we talk about here in terms of Chicago's future is the fragmentation and how fragmented the government structure is here in Chicago. And I think we kind of touched base on it, but how do we move forward? Do we eliminate some of the, government roles? Do we shrink sort of the local governments and how fragmented it is? Or just sort of your advice on that?
Well, I think, it's interesting because in some ways, I think we're doing things better when we have, for instance, an elected school board coming up, when we have community oversight over the police. We're creating bodies, I think, that will change some of the aged structures that exist now. So for instance, having a consent decree and community organizations overseeing some of the police reforms is going to be very helpful. I think the way you structure those, practically speaking, you don't want to create a whole nother government body that is doing duplicate work. So that was the most of the back and forth with community oversight over the police was how much power are we duplicating? And those are serious questions. And a lot of people were like, who cares? But, the question that just came earlier was you have 1,400 entities in Northeastern Illinois, and you just keep creating new and new entities, but you don't get rid of the old ones. That's a pretty serious issue. And can the tax system bear that burden? Can people bear that burden? And I don't think they can if we just keep going in that direction. But we do need that oversight. So I think having change structures, but also you also need people coming into government that this is the hardest part, I think, is getting people into government that maybe sacrifice isn't the right word to use, but look at it and say, I'm not going to use it as a stepping stone to something else or a profit-making type business. And Professor Simpson's seen this for decades longer than I have, that aldermen especially sometimes come in, we've changed our ethics rules. We've made them a lot tighter so that you're not being able to do lobbying at the same time. But a lot of people come into government just for personal interest, and we've got to figure out a way to do away with that, through legislation, but also through educating people as they're coming up that you can't use government as a vehicle for profit, self-profit or profit for others. And so that kind of goes, you need people too coming in to say, like, for instance, I'll just use the workers' comp thing again. I need to be able to give that up and say that should go to a third party that will do a lot better job and do away with 50 types of jobs that were sort of patronage jobs and say I'm gonna give that up. But I think that's going to take a lot of will and effort from new government officials and from the public to say, we need a concerted effort to do away with that.
And Scott, you served under both the Rahm Emanuel Rubber Stamp City Council and the current divided council under Lori Lightfoot. How do you evaluate the two, and do you see it as progress?
I think we've made great progress. This mayor has, I think, different factions that oppose what she's doing for different reasons, and I think that's fine. Under Emanuel and Daley, it's a lot more difficult, I think, being an alderman there, because you pretty much knew you were going to lose every time some issue came up, because they had more of a foothold on every alderman. There was a lot more horse trading, backroom deals. I think you can speak to it too. You watched it for decades under Daley and others. This mayor does create some controversies, does push back in different ways that if I were mayor, maybe I wouldn't, but that's her own approach. That's her own personality. Every mayor is going to have their way of doing things. But I think this idea that there's, as long as people are voting, I think, on principle and not on personalities, but what we've seen, some of what's happening is a lot on personalities. There's pushback from some of the old regime that are still in council that have tried to use the old rule book, or change the rule book to what was 40 years ago or 30 years ago against the mayor, and I don't really appreciate that too much. So sort of bending the rules as they go. But there's so much more back and forth now, and but I think a lot of when I look back at under Daley and Rahm, I can't remember very many times when we ever got a progressive push on things. Maybe on the minimum wage where they bent a little bit, and we were able to get some people on board things. But now, the Progressive Caucus, for instance, we've gotten a lot of things in this budget and last year's budget that never happened in the 2 decades prior. So there's a little give and take there, but I think also enough to have more close votes that could bode well for the future.
Well, thank you very much for being with us, Alderman, and talking to us about the future of Chicago and the role of the City Council. We deeply appreciate you being present. And if any students need to meet with us, we'll still be here. Thank you, though, Scott.
Okay, appreciate it, and feel free to reach out if anything pops up. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for being here.
Hi, I have a quick question.